I define the MVP award as not necessarily the best player, right? Has Shohei Ohtani been the best player? No, I think Aaron Judge has been the best player.
You already know it's your boy Rashid McDonald, and with me I have a very special guest, a good friend who's been in the industry for a long time, Michael Barron. He got started with SNY and then did some work covering the Mets for MLB.com, and now he's on JustMets.net, and they do good work over there. If you are looking for a source where you could get something that's legit and not just, keyboard warriors talking and giving their opinions, go visit the guys at justmets.net. They have good stuff for you guys over there, especially if you love the Mets like we love the Mets. So how are you doing, Michael? How have you been?
Oh, I'm doing all right. A little bit of a roller coaster with this team, but doing, you know, look, I'm happy that they're where they are, and I'm excited again to even watch them and talk about them, and I think this is long overdue. No matter what happens, like, it's been an interesting season, but a fun second half to say the least. Really fun. No, since June 1st, it's been a lot of fun watching this team. So see if they have enough in the tank.
Right. So earlier on this season, I was just observing how the team was being ran by the front office. And one thing that I noticed with David Stearns is that he did something that previous GMs and people that were in charge never usually did during the season. And that was making adjustments early on in the season. It was with the Yon Ramirez getting DFA'd and Michael Tonkin getting DFA'd. So my question is, how has been your evaluation of David Stearns with those moves in the season?
Well, I agree, but I think it's more than that. The moves that they made, and it really came at the end of May, right before this great stretch started. They weren't just moves on the on the perimeter of the roster. They weren't marginal changes. Like, they made consequential changes to the roster. They turned over 4 or 5 players. They addressed the backup catcher situation. They sent Omar Narvaez out, who was providing negative value, and brought in Luis Torrens, who was an immediate upgrade just defensively alone. And then what he's provided offensively has obviously been a bonus. And I think moves like that, among the other bullpen moves with what's his name, the right-hander who threw the fit in the clubhouse, Pablo Lopez, I think his name is.
Oh,
I get
yeah,
that name
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right. I mean, and that was to me like the last day, the last straw for David Stearns. He was like, people were going to be held accountable for their actions and their performance and their behavior, and they held the team meeting from there, and things seemed to change for this team. And I think, there's a lot of talent in the room. Don't get me wrong, but I think David Stearns, drew a hard line in the sand from an accountability perspective and said, like, no matter what happens the rest of the way, you know, we're going to um, account for ourselves more and better and differently than we have in the past. And I think that has really set into the clubhouse. I think they went about their business in a different way from that day forward. And you're seeing the results on the field. Like, who would have thought that at 22 and 33, it would be September 10th, September 11th, September 12th, and they'd be in a wild card spot, right? I mean, they're a different team than they were the first 2 months of the year, a different personality, a different energy level. And, despite, a bad game last night against Toronto, I mean, you know, I have every bit of confidence that they're going to right this ship and win the series, right? And 4 months ago, you would have said, "Oh, there's no way they're winning today," right? So there's a difference right there, just in the culture and the accountability. So, and I think you can thank David Stearns for that. I mean, he's a legit guy, and for the first time in a long time, this organization has had someone leading the charge who I don't want to say just seems to know what he's doing. I think that's a stupid thing to say, but I think his experience, I think his track record, and I think his personality, and whatever he does well has resonated well with this club. and you're seeing the results on the field. They're getting more out of this team and roster than anyone could have expected. I mean, I remember when they were just 2 days ago when they were 14 games over 500. I said to my dad, I said, "How on earth is this team 14 games over 500? Right? How is
Right.
it even possible? Right?" And it's not like it's not like what the Dodgers have done, where they're 30 games over 500. But for this team, and on this date, given where they were last year and all the dead money on the payroll, you have to hand it to David Stearns and Carlos Mendoza for keeping the boat afloat and changing the culture and making people accountable. And you know it's why they are where they are. They're not going to pander to the BS of players in the room anymore, and they're not going to pander to the press and make moves out of desperation. They're making calculated, strategic, calm and steady moves that are better for the organization, both short and long term. It doesn't mean like we agree with every roster decision, but I think we all understand what they're trying to do. And you can say they're as smart as the record says they are, and they're pretty smart. They're 14 games over 500. It's a pretty smart organization right now. So I'm not complaining.
Right, right. I can second that and those thoughts. So the Mets just finished coming off a tough 10-game stretch, right? It was Baltimore for 3, then they had to go to San Diego for a 4-game set, and then Arizona. And that's where things started getting a little crazy and a little loopy, right? Fans were, after Edwin Diaz blew that last save in San Diego, it was like, oh man, but they had a good road trip there, right? They split that series, they took the series against Arizona, and then they handled business. And Francisco Lindor, I think, was the one that was talking about how, yes, the White Sox aren't playing good, so we're going to have to come up with energy on our own to keep it going. And they did, man. They went on a 9-game winning streak, and that was absolutely amazing to see. Now that they're off of it, it's a little bit like, oh, man. But what are your takeaways from that 9-game winning streak?
Well, I think it kind of started. I guess it all started when Edwin Diaz blew the second game on the road trip, right? That's when it almost seemed like the team had said, "That's it, enough," right? They were kind of meandering, playing decently, you know, but they were about playing five. They were about 500 on that road trip, and then he blew that save, and it was they were 4 games behind the Braves, and everybody's writing them off, saying, "Well, that was it. That's the season. It's been a nice run, but they're just not good enough," right?
Right.
And I'm probably guilty of saying that, in private channels as well. Like they're all right. They're just not good enough. And then it seemed like the Edwin Diaz went out for that day game in Arizona, and the whole thing changed from there. And they went on that absolute tear. Obviously, they did what they were supposed to do in Chicago. But then they came home and beat, albeit a reeling Red Sox team, but a plus 500 Red Sox team.
Right.
And then they beat up on the Reds. They didn't score a whole lot of runs, but the Reds are a lot better than their record would suggest. They have their issues, but that's not a bad team. That they should be better than they are.
Correct.
And I think they took them to school a little bit. They outpitched them, they outplayed them, they outclassed them. And Ellie De La Cruz, by the way, is really, really a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah, yeah, he is.
You know, and so I think they demonstrated, despite what the record, like they won 6 straight games against 2 pretty good teams, took care of business against the White Sox, and look, when you win a lot of games like that, you're going to be back in the race. So look at the Tigers; they've been on a roll lately. Look at where they are; they're 2-3 games out. Who would have thought the Tigers? Can you imagine the Tigers and the Mets make the playoffs?
Right.
So yeah, I don't want to say the culture changed that day, but it seems like they found that extra gear that all teams need coming down the stretch. Now, in the end, that was a soft part of their schedule. The Red Sox are in the end. The Reds are in the end. The White Sox, we all know what the White Sox are.
Right.
So, you can argue it in any number of ways. In the end, wins are wins. They rattled off 9 in a row, 10 of 11, after 2 pretty devastating losses on that West Coast road trip. Those are devastating, gut-wrenching losses where they were wins until they weren't. And it takes a lot of character for any team in any sport at any level to be able to rebound from that, right? And to be able to stay even, not get too high on the highs, not get too low in the lows, as a ball player might say, and be able to rebound from something like that, especially the player himself, right, who has just had an awful season until then. And then it seems like he learned his lesson. I mean, it's been fastball city for him ever since. I mean, although on Monday night there were a few too many spinners in the middle of the plate. I don't know if you noticed that, but
Yeah, it
I'm like
was.
too many sliders there, my
Mm-hmm.
friend. But just stick with what's working right now. But that's the cultural part I talked about, right? Because we've seen so many Met teams endure losses like that, including this one earlier in the year in May, when they would, how many games Edwin Diaz blow in May? What, 4 or 5, just all by himself?
Yeah.
They ended up they were miserable, 22 and 33. And then, but you knew today, like, maybe they weren't going to go on a run like they did, but you knew, I had a feeling they weren't going to let those two losses, get to them too much. Even though I was like, well, these are these are games they should have won. They lost ground in the standings as a result. They're just too far behind. But I didn't think, from a cultural perspective, like they were going to let it bother them too much. I didn't think they were just going to tank, like so
Right.
many Met teams have in the past.
Right.
Um, and it's a great foundation for whatever is next, whether they get to the playoffs this year or they're, building up to a championship caliber team, next year and the year after. Like you have to start from down here in order to get up here. And
Correct.
I think this is a great first step, regardless of what the outcome is of this season.
I agree. I agree. In that Reds series, we saw that Jeff McNeil got hit somewhere in the wrist or forearm area, and initially we thought he was okay because he went to first,
Yeah.
kind of looked like he shook it off, but X-rays came back, has a fracture, done for the season. How big of a loss is this for the Mets?
Well, I mean, he's been a different player in the second half. I mean, there's no question about it. It's a huge loss. I think, one of the things the Mets are very good at offensively, or had been good at offensively until recently anyway, is their ability to make contact. And despite Jeff McNeil's struggles for the better part of 2 years,
Right.
he's able to make some sort of contact the majority of the time, right? And he sort of epitomizes, what the Mets are good at offensively this year. When you go from Jeff McNeil, even if it's a fraction of what McNeil used to be, to players like, DJ Stewart or, some of these other like fringe major league players that they brought up to replace him. And there's really there's no replacing that, within the organization right now.
Right.
Again, like I think you can question, why they wouldn't go with an element of speed in Acuna in this case. Maybe not get him at bats, but maybe he's a late game replacement, maybe a defensive sub or whatever. But you're not going to replace when one of your better and higher paid players gets hurt, especially when he's been on a hot streak. Like there's no replacing it. So it's a big blow. I think it's survivable. I think they have enough depth on this roster to be able to overcome it. I mean, let's not forget, like while they lost him, they have this guy named Jose Iglesias, who's been a wizard on the field. He's been the same kind of contact-centric guy at the plate. And, like he's been this cultural inspiration for this club ever since they, unburied him from the minor leagues, which just seems like, a crime based on the way he's played since they brought him to the major leagues. So, I don't think they're going to lose too much, but I think, you have to be careful not to overexpose Iglesias either, especially with the upcoming schedule, what they have. The Phillies for 3. I'm sorry, the Phillies for 4. No, they have the Phillies for 3, the Nationals for 3, the Phillies for 4, the Braves for 3, and Milwaukee for 3. It's very easy to overexpose, the second tier player in a schedule like that. So, but he's been great, and he's a big reason why he's here, with or without McNeil. So I think he deserves to be their starting. He deserves to start every single day, and should start every single day.
That is true. I do believe that. I think Jose Iglesias is a good piece that you can plug in there if you do want to go with someone to replace McNeil. It won't be the same production like you mentioned, but Iglesias has been good. It's sort of like he's just rejuvenated and rejuvenated, so you need to stick with that if you can. Even though I wouldn't mind them seeing what they have in Acuna, I feel like sometimes in the past we've seen how some players, when they know that they're borderline ready to get called up, they get bored in AAA, and then their production kind of But
I don't know. I don't know if that's it with Acuna. I think there are issues with his game. I don't think his bat is really ready to play here. But
okay,
that's not what he would be brought here to do. Like they're not in a position to see what guys can do in a pennant race. That they need the asset. They need people who bring value to the roster. And the one thing that will always be big league is speed, right?
right,
So and defense for that matter. But in his case specifically, it's speed. And I'd rather, like personally, like I'd rather the club give him an opportunity to be that seventh, eighth, ninth inning pinch runner. When they need a stolen base or they need some first or third speed, especially like if like the number 9 hitter reaches, you want to get him in as a pinch runner. Now you got your contact guys coming up. You have a first, the third option, and by bringing him into the game there, like you're not asking him to get up there and hit 400. You're
right,
not asking him to go up there and spin double plays with Francisco Lindor. He'd be the 28th guy in the roster. You're just asking him to run, for a few weeks. And I don't think, with all due respect, Stewart was one of the few that had hits last night for what it's worth.
true,
But I don't think Stewart provides, Stewart's not going to, he's not exactly like a barn, like the speed demon out there, right? He's a minus defensively, right? And his offense, he's hitting under 200. So, like, with that said, should your 28th guy be someone who brings, who can score you that extra run? Who can start a rally, who can, distract the opposing pitchers rather. And like, that's how I would have played it. Are they going to lose? Are they going to lose this wild card because they didn't call up Acuna? No. Like that, if that's what it comes down to, they got bigger problems than that. So, it's just a decision I disagree with. It's not an indictment on David Stearns or anybody. It's just
right.
I would have brought speed to the table, right? That's what today's game has become about. It's become about pitching, defense, and speed, right? And I would have enhanced that part of their roster, but that's all.
I agree. Now, Francisco Lindor. He has been on some type of run this season, and specifically over the last 3 months, he has just firmly put himself in the conversation for MVP. Now, there's someone else a part of that conversation, Shohei Ohtani, who is on the verge of having a 50-50 season, something that no major league player has ever done. And so my question would be, is Shohei Ohtani getting 50-50 too much for Lindor to overcome and get an MVP?
It always depends how you define the MVP award, right? I mean, I define the MVP award as not necessarily the best player, right? Has Shohei Ohtani been the best player? No, I think Aaron Judge has been the best player, right? So I think Ohtani is amazing. I think he's a once in a life. It's not once in a generation. This is once in a lifetime. The kind of what he's capable of doing, and I take nothing away from from him with what I'm about to say.
Right.
First off, I don't think Lindor is going to win the MVP because of essentially what you just said, but I don't agree with that because that's not how I define the MVP.
Right.
When I look at the Dodgers, and if I take Ohtani out of that equation, I'd still bet $1,000 that they're going to win the division.
Correct.
Right? If you take Francisco Lindor out of the equation, and I'm not even just talking about his offense, and I know there's a kicker argument that says, well, Lindor does it on the other side of the ball too, and that's fair.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take his offense and you take his defense out of the equation and you replace him with even the next best shortstop in the National League,
right?
The Mets are we're not even having this conversation right now about the Mets being in contention. All right. That's just, more than likely the truth about the difference in value that Ohtani has to the Dodgers versus versus what Lindor means to the Mets. And if that's how you define what the MVP award is, not necessarily this year's best overall player start to finish, not necessarily this year's best offensive and defensive force, or not necessarily, a pitcher who has just exceeded every single bar for any other offensive player. But if we define the MVP as the player who is most valuable, his or her most valuable to his team, excuse me, then Lindor should win it on those grounds.
Correct.
But we all know, first of all, I don't have a vote. Second of all, that's not how everybody views this, right?
That is
They'll
true.
just say, well, Ohtani is going to do something nobody else has ever done.
Right.
He's an amazing unicorn and a spectacle and all that stuff. And we can make history by making him the American League MVP and the National League MVP.
Right.
Let's make some history. I think a lot of that plays into the vote, how the voters see this. There's also the West Coast bias.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the New York bias. And I think a lot of the New York voters for both the Mets and the Yankees, who cover the Mets and the Yankees, will vote for Lindor.
Right.
But I think ultimately, you're kind of going against the grain at the same time if you're not voting for Ohtani, which seems stupid. But I think you got to vote with your heart and your gut. And if your heart and gut says, Ohtani just is he's so valuable to the Dodgers, that's fine. And that's to me, you're being as objectively subjective as you can be in the argument. But and I don't want to sound like a homer with respect to Lindor.
Right.
I mean, I watch the Mets and I follow the Mets and I see how they are with him, and I see how his supporting cast performs with him and how they're doing right now that he's hit a little bit of a cold snap.
Right.
And you can't tell me he's not more valuable to the Mets than Ohtani is to the Dodgers. No, you can't say that, because if Ohtani goes into a slump, which, by the way, he has hit a slump, he does hit slumps. There's always Freeman, Betts, Teoscar Hernandez, Will Smith, Max Muncy, all these other guys.
Yeah, they're stacked.
Right, they're a stacked lineup, right? And they're not making Ohtani better. Ohtani's making them better. And I totally dig it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you subtract Ohtani from that calculus, they're still probably winning that division. The Mets are probably 500, maybe a little bit less. I mean, that's how valuable Lindor has been.
Yep.
Does that make the argument? You're asking the wrong guy.
Right. We'll see when it comes to that. One more thing on the MVP thing. I found it funny because I did a little bit of research, and I know it doesn't, because it's two different eras, so it doesn't kind of fit the same thing. But 1947, Ted Williams hit over 400, and he won the Triple Crown and did not win the MVP. Crazy.
You're talking about 1941?
Yeah, it was in 40. It was 41, 42, and then it happened to him again in 47.
So who won the MVP in 1940? I want to say Joe DiMaggio.
I think, Joe won it in one of those years.
Joe DiMaggio won it in 1941 with a 1083 OPS.
Right.
30 homers, 125 RBIs, 357 batting average. Ted Williams hit 401 that year, which just seems so insane. Ted Williams, he finished second I'm assuming he finished second in the MVP. Yeah, he was second in the MVP. One, as you said, he didn't win the Triple Crown, but he had a 1287 OPS, so 200 points higher, 37 homers, 120 RBIs, 736, 553 OPS, 735.
I mean, those numbers are just insane. And he didn't win MVP. So
no.
It doesn't always mean that the best numbers should win MVP. But,
Well, I mean, there were issues there for Ted Williams, too. One of which was that he wasn't exactly a media darling. during his playing days,
That
and
is true.
everybody loved Joe DiMaggio.
Oh
And
yeah.
and Joe DiMaggio was on the Yankees, and remember that era of Yankee baseball, and the Yankees were good, the Red Sox stunk, and that and Ted Williams' consistent handling of the media during his lifetime probably played a role in his inability to win the MVP award that year, because if you're again like you go back to the numbers argument, as awesome as DiMaggio was in 1941, like there's no conversation here, right?
Right.
So
Right.
you know, but again, it was like you said, it was a different era. There were different elements in play,
Yep.
working for Joe DiMaggio, working against Ted Williams, and Ted Williams also at times made his own bed, and he would freely admit that, towards the end of his life too. So, I think it's one of many cases where the best player didn't necessarily win the MVP. I couldn't tell you, it was 83 years ago, and I was, my mother wasn't even born at that year. So, all I can do is look back on history and read about it, and and listen to people, and that's what I come away with between the DiMaggio and Ted Williams argument. I couldn't tell you how valuable Joe DiMaggio was to that team. I never watched him, never saw it. I've seen little clips here and there from that season, right? He had the 56 game hitting streak that year. That was another thing that probably played into his favor. You could probably think of other more recent examples of. Every year we're always arguing about the MVP. It seems, right?
Right.
There's the argument that Mike Trout, he's he was the game's best player for 10 years, and how many MVP awards did he win without that team even sniffing the postseason? So,
True.
in those cases, the argument is, well, the best player won the MVP award,
Right.
and that may be true, but they're also, it's a subjective vote. It's very, people will say, well, the stats here, the stats there. In the end, it's a subjective vote. My vote would be, well, here are the stats for Lindor. Here's, his value, and blah 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 blah. He's the MVP. And other people would say, well, here's Shohei Ohtani, 50-50. He's going to hit a bazillion home runs. He's a unicorn. He does it on both sides of the ball. He's the MVP, right?
Right.
And neither argument is incorrect. It's an opinion. A vote is an opinion. When you vote for president, when you vote for an MVP, it's just your opinion, right? So
That is true.
that's all it is.
Yep. That's all it is. So, one of the other valuable players on the Mets this year, I think we will all agree, has been Mark Vientos. And he didn't start the season with the team. And that was...
Speaking of criminal.
Right. That was a decision. I think in the beginning of the year, they said they both had good springs and they just went with Beatty. I don't know why. But Mark Vientos spent a month in AAA. But since getting called up on May 15th, he has just put up some of the best numbers at the third base position. And right now, currently, among third basemen who have 250 at-bats or more, he is top in slugging. Yep. So what has been your thoughts on Mark Vientos since him getting called up to the major leagues?
Quite honestly, everybody seems surprised at the way he's hit. I'm really not surprised. I always thought he was going to hit here.
Right.
Is it sustainable? I don't know. But I always thought, you could see the swing. You could see, all the peripheral stats and the metrics that would suggest he was going to be a very good hitter in the big leagues. And it was even Bryce Harper when he was struggling earlier in the year. He said he spoke to Bryce Harper. And Bryce Harper, you tell him, dude, just relax and hit. You got so much power. Stop trying so hard. Something to that effect.
Right. And
that sort of helped transform Mark Vientos, into kind of that AAA 4A player and, to this star player, which is what they have now. I think the biggest surprise with Vientos to me is how valuable he's been at third base.
Yeah.
Because like I said, I thought he was going to hit, but he's got an amazing arm. I think he's shown he's not great at third base yet, but I think he's better than they thought he was going to be. Certainly, we thought he was going to be. He's
Right.
got an amazing arm, and I think he's done things they didn't think he could do, which is why they buried him in the minor leagues for the first 6 weeks of the season, right?
Correct.
And they tried to stay patient with the higher draft pick and in Brett Beatty,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like enough was enough. Like they had to, he became an ineffective player. They had to do something. So they went. They knew. I think they knew Vientos was going to come here and at least not be what Beatty was.
Right.
Maybe they didn't think he would blossom into what he is right now. But I I think they believed he would eventually hit. They were just so worried about the situation at third base, which is why they were testing him out at first base. And
Mm-hmm.
they were wrong, right? They were wrong about Pete Alonso too when they said, well, he's got all this power, he's got major league power right now, but he stinks at first base. Like that's what they would say.
Right. That
And
that
he
was.
never stunk at first base,
Nope.
not for 1 minute.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes they're wrong, and they were wrong about Vientos. I'm just glad they quickly pivoted and they fixed it. I commend him for not wallowing in his own misery from when they signed JD Martinez. He went to the minors, proved he
Yep.
belonged, and here he is. He's a star, and now he's playing alongside JD Martinez and outperforming JD Martinez.
That is true. That is true. That is true. Another guy who has had a great season for the Mets that come a little bit unexpected, right, is Sean Menaea. I didn't think he was going to be as good as he is, right? I always thought he was going to have like maybe some Taiwan Walker numbers before the All-Star break. I kind of always saw them as kind of similar in a sense. But Sean Menaea has been just an ace, right, so far for the Mets. What do you think?
Well, I think it's so, the starting rotation it's a strange rotation. I think if he was in the Yankee rotation or the Dodger rotation, he'd probably be somewhat of an afterthought. But in this rotation, yeah, I mean, he seems like an ace. I think, culturally, well, I shouldn't. Let me back up. I think things changed for him a year and a half ago. When he was with the Giants and he was relegated to the bullpen, and he kind of had to. If he was going to survive, he had to evolve and transform and change some of the things from what he was doing in the past and become really a crafty pitcher. And I know he's benefited from the driveline baseball thing in Washington State. He's learned this sweeper, which has been game-changing good for him over the last year and a half. But I think also like he's evolved as I don't want to say it took him a while to become a quality like a big league pitcher, but I feel like he's having as good a year as he's ever had this year. I don't think there's any question about it. But I remember watching him when he was with Oakland and San Diego, especially when he was with San Diego a couple of years ago, and the Mets were in that found themselves in a playoff race with him. And like he's a different guy, he's a different pitcher. I think this is a good fit for him with Jeremy Hefner. I think culturally, again, like it's a good fit for him, and is in that he's got a quirky personality, which he's I come to appreciate in ball players. I think it's a good snug fit for him, which is partially why he's excelling in the manner that he is. He reminds me a lot of. I don't want to say he reminds me a lot of Al Leiter, but he does with a lot of those pitches that break hard and in like Al Leiter's cutter used to. When I watch him, I see a lot of Al Leiter in him, which is a big compliment.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone's ever seen Al Leiter, he was, great, and he was clutch. He's a clutch pitcher for them, and I think Menaea's come up clutch for them too. He's been steady and healthy. I'd like him to cut down on the walks a little bit, but the way his stuff moves, like he's gonna, a lot of balls are gonna be out, outside the strike zone, and he's gonna end up walking a lot of batters. But he's got so much movement. And that sweeper, like I said, has been game-changing good for him, where it's, he's evolved as a pitcher, and it's almost like this was his maturity season. And, I sure hope he stays. He said yesterday or the day before that he wants to stay with the club.
Yeah.
I think it's a great fit for them over a 2 to 3 year period. I think they should get that done now, ahead of the off season. He's here. Have a conversation with him, see where it goes. Don't let him
Yeah.
opt out. I think, with all the work they need to do in the rotation,
Yep.
he's as good a fit and a proven fit for them as there is out there. And I think it's an easy box to check. He's been fantastic. And I think he will be fantastic again if they retain him.
I agree. So now we're going to get into the Mets series with the Phillies. We touched up on it a little bit. The Mets have a 10-game stretch where they face the Phillies 7 times in 10 days. And we're going to take a look at the Phillies rotation. They got Aaron Nola, Ranger Suarez, Zach Wheeler, Taijuan Walker, Christopher Sanchez. And over the last 7 games, the only starting pitcher that has done good for them, numbers-wise, is Zach Wheeler, former Met, good friend, who...
I don't know if he's such a good friend anymore.
Right, not anymore, right? He, but he did change his career around with the Phillies, and he's a far, better pitcher now than he was before. And I believe he could have been as good if he re-signed with the Mets. That was just a completely...
The Mets totally screwed that up.
Yeah,
and they said all the wrong things after he signed with the Phillies. Brody Van Wagenen. I'm sure he'd like to have that one back. What he said about him, and because Wheeler, pardon my French, has stuck it up the Mets' ass ever since he left. So
true.
And with a vengeance and a purpose. So, if Wheeler has any. Has any anger towards the Mets, I think it's justified. I'll give him that one.
That's true, and we'll definitely see that this series when he does take the mound against the Mets.
They're going to miss him. I think they're actually missing Wheeler.
In
this series. Which is not the worst thing in the world here. So
that's true.
Let me just verify that before I put. Yeah, he's pitching tonight against Tampa Bay. So
so
they're going to miss him.
So then that means they're looking at maybe Taijuan Walker, Christopher Sanchez, and Aaron Nola. But of those 3, Christopher Sanchez has the better number. I'm confused with the Aaron Nola not pitching good the last 7 games. He is a good pitcher, but I mean, what do you think the Phillies are going to bring pitching wise against the Mets?
Well, I mean, the Phillies are an interesting bunch. They haven't been what they were in the first half. They're and I'm going to give you the pitching numbers in a second. But they're it's been a little bit of a struggle for them. Like it hasn't come in as easy for them, as one might expect, right?
Right.
Since the All-Star break, the starters have a 4.53 ERA. That's 21st in the league.
Yeah.
Right. So their starting pitching has become a little bit vulnerable as time has gone on. Taijuan Walker, I think they moved him to the bullpen. I think that's what I saw the other day. Mm-hmm. And they're by the way, their bullpen has been middle of the pack. So, their pitching is, if the Mets can get their offense back in gear, which, is a little bit problematic right now.
Yeah.
But if they can get their offense back in gear, they're going to be able to, play nice with Phillies during this stretch, assuming these numbers hold up, and, of course, teams tend to rise to the occasion when you're in pennant fever. So, we'll see if the Phillies can, turn some things around, for the like I said, they're fortunate to be avoiding Wheeler, at least in this series, but
then the 4 at
I
home.
think they're going to get him. If I do the math, they're going to get him at Citi Field next week. So, yeah.
So they got
perhaps on that Sunday, and the Phillies, I mean, I'm sure if they have any off days, and I haven't looked at their schedule, they'll probably align the rotation to get Wheeler in against the Mets. So,
for sure. I think they're going to do that. Offensively, though, Kyle Schwarber, Mets killer, is turned it on home run wise as of late.
He's an everyone killer.
Right.
He's an everyone killer. He's not just a Met killer.
And it just right. So he's not the only bat in that lineup that's dangerous, but he is the number 1 suspect for me when it comes to the Phillies offense. Right now, he is hitting .360 over the last 7 games with a .920 slugging and 4 home runs and 9 of 25. Kyle Schwarber, worried?
I'm always worried about him, and he's having, what I love about Schwarber and what he's done this year, is that he's changed the narrative about his game. Because last year, his batting, he finished with a sub 200 batting average. So the Phillies, I remember when the Phillies spun that and said, well, if you look at the walks and you combine that with the hits, the average is really higher. And I was like, that's an absolutely ridiculous argument, but
Right.
he's done a good job changing the narrative. He's making more contact while drawing the same number of walks. I mean, he still has 176 strikeouts, but he's not going to strike out. He strikes out 40 times in the next 15 games. Like, the Phillies are in trouble. Like, put it that way. And
that is true.
Kudos to him for, like I said, changing the narrative on his offense and improving as a hitter, right? Because now, he's the complete package this year. His OPS is only, I would say, nominally higher than it was last year, but look, he's making more contact, and when that guy makes contact, like, there's a lot of damage. So, he's going to hurt the Mets in this 7-game series. Trey Turner's going to hurt the Mets. It's always, they haven't played well against them the last couple of years, and the Mets have lost 4 or 6 against them this year, I think. So
yeah,
it hadn't been a good matchup until that series in London in June. They haven't seen him, in 3 months.
Then.
So.
Yep.
I think it's, you have to throw a lot of that out the window in these 7 games, especially with, so much at stake for, I think the Mets are playing with more urgency and a little bit more gusto than they were, earlier in the season. I don't think the Phillies have a whole lot at stake in this series. I think they just need to make sure there are no sweeps at their expense.
Yeah.
Certainly they don't want to get swept in 4 to the Mets, because that would change the NL East a lot. But
big time.
I also don't think that's going to happen. The Mets aren't going to Philadelphia and sweeping them. So.
No.
They're great. The Phillies, to me, like, if I'm putting money on the season, I'd put money for them to win the World Series. They're solid, they're strong, they're powerful, they have a lot of energy. The pitching is very, very good, despite what the second half numbers are. Like, I still wouldn't, I wouldn't. There are very few other pitchers I'd want to give the ball to in Game 7 other than Zach Wheeler at this point.
Correct.
I just wish it was for the Mets and not for the Phillies, but they have that. The Phillies have that X factor, right? I think the Mets have that X factor too. I don't think the Braves have that X factor. But I just don't know. Given the way the schedule is aligned, that the Mets will have enough in the tank. When you have 7 out of 10 coming up against the Phillies, and 3 against the Braves and 3 against the Brewers, like, it's going to be tough. That's a very, very difficult schedule.
It is.
I think the one thing the Mets have working in their favor this weekend is that
the Braves face
correct me if I'm wrong.
The Braves face the Dodgers.
Right, the Dodgers are going to Atlanta. So, I mean, I think that you can't ever predict anything, obviously, but that is probably the only thing. If the Mets can come out of Philly with 2, that would be amazing. And then whatever happens in Atlanta, that's a bonus. So we'll see. It should be interesting. I'm curious to see, because this is important going in. If the Mets are going to be in the playoffs, right? It's important to see how the Mets look against the Phillies at this point. This is a different Met team with a different dynamic, different bullpen. Everything is different about them than it was 3 months ago. And so, it's good. I don't think we know what to expect. I mean, we say, oh my God, they're playing the Phillies 7 out of 10. Maybe that's a good thing. They've been 27-14 against 500 teams, teams that are 500 or better since May 30th. I mean, that's got to be worth something, right?
It is. And I think that they will get up for this series. They've done it. Yeah. They've done it for the majority of the season, right? They got up for the Yankees series. They swept them. They even took a series from the Dodgers earlier in the year. Now, that was earlier in the year, so I know it doesn't matter now. But they did it, right? They beat the Orioles when they needed to do it. They split with San Diego when they needed to do it. And then they took that series from Arizona.
There.
Yeah, they should have.
The thing is, they should have gotten 3 in San Diego, and they should have gotten all 3 in Arizona.
Yep. And they definitely should have. And I think they need to leave no stone unturned in this series against the Phillies. So we're going to hit you with a quick 3 to 4 rapid questions right here. Get some answers quickly. So first one, if the Mets make the postseason, who starts Game 1 and Game 2?
I think you have to worry about that when you get there. I mean, I'd give the ball to Menaea if the rotation lines up that way, but you may not. You may need Menaea on, that weekend. That's Saturday or Sunday. So
Right.
in Milwaukee. And by the way, if they win the third wild card and the division winners stay as they are, they're going to play Milwaukee that last weekend, and then play Milwaukee again in the wild card series in Milwaukee.
Right. So that definitely is on the cards for the Mets. So Carlos Mendoza has shown true managing skills and leadership skills. Is he the NL Manager of the Year?
For my money, he is, but apparently Pat Murphy's. If you ask Mets Twitter, Pat Murphy's giving him a run for his money. So, but I would say like Carlos Mendoza has to at least is top two.
Has to be, right. It definitely has to be. And the Brewers have won that division for a few years now. And I understand they've given up a lot, but it's still the Brewers. It's still the same team. And Pat Murphy was around that team recently. So it's not like he just came out of nowhere.
It's similar to the MVP argument. It's
Subjective.
a subjective vote.
Yep. If the Mets fail to make it into the postseason, do we go scorch earth on the Mets, or are we headed in the right direction as a team and an organization?
Headed in the right direction. There's no going scorched earth on a season like this at this point.
I agree. Last question. Does Pete Alonso return to the Mets?
I gotta go. Yes, I'm gonna go with yes.
Okay. I personally, I wouldn't be either way. And that's crazy to say, like, oh my God, if they lose Pete Alonso, how can you not, like, how can they replace his production? I think they'll find a way. I think David Stearns has shown his ability again to evaluate very, very well, and he can find them. And not saying that Pete Alonso isn't worth whatever it is that he may want. I'm just saying I wouldn't be as angry as some would be if Pete Alonso does not return.
Well, that's because he's not having as good a year as he's had in the past. And
True.
I just think it's one of those things where, like, yes, it's been an off year for him, but we can't throw, the five previous years away because of a few bad months. He's still going to hit 35 home runs. He's still going to have, 85 to 90 RBIs, right? Is his OPS where it should be? No. Is he not hitting with runners in scoring position? Unquestionably.
Right.
Right? But he's one of those guys, and we said that about Carlos Beltran. We said it about David Wright. We said it about so many Mets. He's one of those guys that you're not going to know what you have until you don't have him anymore.
True.
Believe me.
I agree.
It's not so simple to say, oh well, we'll just replace his production. We'll just get Juan Soto. We'll replace him. Why not get both?
Both.
Right? Imagine having both.
Oh
right?
my God.
And having everything else, right? That's the opportunity. And if Alonso is being genuine when he says he wants to stay in New York, he loves New York, and Steve Cohen has said, we're going to worry about this in the end of the offseason, but we got Nimmo done, we got all these other ones done, we're going to get this done too.
That is true.
I think you don't let that marriage get divorced. I think this is something long-term. I think it's an opportunity for the Mets to build history, to build a legacy.
Mm-hmm.
I have visions of Pete Alonso hitting his 500th home run in relatively short order with the Mets.
Right.
And setting all of those records, which he'll blow Darryl Strawberry's home run record out of the water.
Oh, out of the
water. He'll blow David Wright's hit record out of the water.
Right.
It's an opportunity to brand themselves with their most prolific power hitter in the history of the franchise.
True.
And that's more prolific than Mike Piazza, even. Right? Why would they let someone who's on a Hall of Fame trajectory go. Because of a bad year?
That is true.
Not with this organization, not with these kinds of resources. They don't have anyone behind them.
That is true. Yeah, that is true. There is no one behind, and there is no one available in free agency if they do let him go, and which is why I think ultimately he will stay. And we'll see how that cookie crumbles. But I do ultimately believe that Pete Alonso will be here for the long haul because, I mean, you have the money. That's not an issue. That's not a problem. Maybe it was going into this season because you had a lot of nasty contracts that you had to get off the books. But the books are going to be clean for next year. And Pete Alonso will reserve some space in that.
Well, and there's this argument to say, well, let Alonso go and move Vientos first and give Beatty another crack. How about
Not so simple. No,
How about
not so simple.
You know, there's an idea. Then why don't you just sign Alonso and save yourself the aggravation?
Right. And they're like, oh, well, wait. Well, Ryan Clifford, what? Wait, why? We're not going that far. Right.
He's ready to get here.
Right.
When he's ready to be here. You worry about it then.
Right.
Don't let future Hall of Famers go.
And you got the DH. If you got the DH, even if Ryan Clifford is ready to play first base, then you put Pete Alonso as a DH, and then boom, you're extending his career even more. So I do agree. Pete Alonso.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. Well, Michael, thank you so much for stopping by and talking Mets with us. Hopefully they take this series against the Phillies. Again, guys, if you have a chance, stop by the justmets.net, subscribe, get your newsletters, get everything Mets when it comes to the Mets on justmets.net. And thanks again for stopping by.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.